Welcome to episode 59 of the Tax Professionals podcast. This episode provides an insight into what it's like to be a tax barrister and how to become one with tax barrister Harriet Brown. This episode is number one of a new series that I'm doing called Role Insights, where you will basically obtain insights into different tax roles from people who undertake those roles.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hey everyone, it's exciting for me to be doing this episode as it's the first episode of the new Role Insights series that I'm doing to provide you with insights into different tax roles. There's so many different potential roles that we can have as tax professionals, too many really, and that can be overwhelming. There's probably many roles each of us will like, but knowing which ones we will like can be difficult. So I'm hoping this series can help you to decide whether a role would be for you, help you to decide whether you want to move into a different role, and just to give you some information about what you need to do to be able to have that role. For a long time, I've been interested in knowing more about what it's like to be a tax barrister, so it's great to kick off this series with Harriet Brown, a qualified tax barrister here in the UK and also in Jersey, and she's part of Old Square Tax Chambers. I enjoy the technical side of tax. Doing research is one of my favourite things to do. I also enjoy providing advice, speaking to clients and debating tax rules with others. And as you'll hear in this episode, I have a bit of a realisation that I think I'd really actually enjoy being a tax barrister. As a barrister, you'll be doing a lot of these things often. Anyway, this episode is broadly broken down into the following sections. Harriet introducing herself, what you have to do to qualify as a tax barrister, what tax barristers typically do in terms of the activities, and I was actually surprised a bit by this, how Harriet's role has evolved over the years, remuneration for barristers, how this works and what you can expect to earn, how barristers' chambers work, and the episode finishes with Harriet giving advice if you're considering becoming a tax barrister. The rough timings for each of these sections can be accessed in the details section of the episode within your podcast player, or by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP59. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP59. TTPP59 just stands for the Tax Professionals Podcast Episode 59. If, like me, you're interested in knowing what you're worth in terms of salary, then get in touch with James from the Tax Recruitment Company to benchmark what you're currently on. From his interaction with many different tax professionals and businesses, he has current knowledge of salary rates based on experience and specialism. Speaking with James could help you to negotiate a pay rise or determine if it's time to find a new role. Contact details for James can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP59, or you can book a chat with him directly by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. So get in touch with James to benchmark your salary or to discuss potentially available roles, particularly if you work in corporation tax, as he's currently recruiting for many roles in this area. You may also be interested in my free email course to help you to figure out the direction that you want to take your career in and to know what you need to do to get there. The course is split down into steps which are referred to as days within the course. There's a single objective behind each day and guidance and suggested actions to help you achieve the objective. You can sign up for that free email course by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/free course. Without further ado, let's get into this episode. So, just to start us off then, Harriet, can you just give us a little bit of an introduction about you and how you're involved in the tax world?
So yes, I am a barrister in England and Wales. I'm also an advocate in Jersey and the Channel Islands. And the way that I sort of came into the tax world, as it were, is I worked in Jersey for 3 years before I came to qualify at the English bar. And while I didn't do tax work in Jersey, I did deal with an awful lot of structures that were tax driven. And so with that in mind, I came back and I did my first 6 months of training in a general chancery set, which is sort of things like wills and trusts. And I missed the sort of structuring that I'd been doing previously. And so I did my second 6 in my current set, Old Square Tax Chambers, and I've been there ever since. So that's sort of what I do in the tax world. Because of my background, I tend to focus on international tax.
Yeah. So I did wonder this actually when I was doing some research before the episode. What does it actually mean to be an advocate in Jersey?
It's the same as a barrister.
Okay, just the equivalent.
Yes, except it's called an advocate, and you get a title. So in court, the judge will refer to you as Advocate Brown.
Okay. How bizarre. I've never actually come across that before.
And indeed, they have exactly the same sort of barrister's uniform, I guess, the gown and the bands, but no wig in Jersey.
Okay. So have you essentially had to like qualify twice then? Have you had to do like twice as much as what you would to just qualify in one jurisdiction?
Not quite twice as much. I have had to qualify twice. So possibly this is a good point to say what you have to do to qualify as a barrister. And the usual way to go about it is to go to university. You can do a law degree or you can do a different degree. If you don't do a law degree, you need to go and do a conversion course. The official name of that course changes, but essentially it's a year-long course where you learn 6 or 7 core legal subjects, and by the end of that, you are in a position to move on to what's referred to as the vocational stage of training, which is a bar practice course. And on that course, you'll learn things like advocacy, how to write opinions, how to do legal research. So I did all of that. And I needed to do that both to qualify in England and Wales and to qualify in Jersey. The next stage for qualifying in England and Wales is called pupillage. And that means you go and do sort of like a year-long sort of interview. The first 6 months, you don't do any practice. The second 6 months, you can practice under supervision. But in my chambers, in your second 6 months, you don't practice because we think there's too much to sort of learn about tax for it to be safe to let you practice at that point. So what happened was, after I'd been to bar school to do my vocational training, I didn't have a pupillage for a year. So I had a year's gap between finishing law school and my training job. And I wanted something to do. And I'd recently done a mini pupillage, that being a period of a few days or a week where you go and shadow a barrister in chambers, and that you sort of need those on your CV to get your actual pupillage. So it's like work experience for barristers. I'd met a barrister who did an awful lot of work with law firms in Jersey. And so I thought I'd have a look at Jersey for a year and ended up staying for 3. And so I then went to Jersey and I had to take some exams. You take 6 exams there because Jersey has completely different law to the UK. After I'd done that, I came back here to my first pupillage, where I stayed for 6 months. And as I say, I moved for that second 6 months. And then at the end of that year, you are qualified as a barrister. So I didn't have to do quite double, but I did have to do 2 lots of, I had to do an extra set of exams, and I had to work in a law firm in Jersey for 2 years as well to qualify there. So it wasn't quite double, but it was quite a bit extra.
Do you know if anyone else has done something similar to you? Because I feel like I've never heard of anyone like practicing in 2, I suppose, countries before, if you want to call it that.
You do get dual qualified people. It's not that common at the bar. I know of one other lady who has done the same thing. Who she doesn't work in tax, though. She sort of does general chancery commercial work. Sometimes people in commercial sets tend to be dual qualified. They might have a qualification in Dubai because there are sort of like international commercial courts there. Sometimes you see people dual qualified in Scotland and England and Wales because that counts as dual qualification.
Yeah.
And sometimes Ireland or Northern Ireland as well. But it's not that common, but it does happen.
Yeah, fair enough. So obviously, as well as practicing as a barrister, you also do a podcast, don't you, with Graham, International Tax Bites?
I do, yes, with Graham Jackson of Hassan's. Yeah.
How long has that one been going on for now?
More than a year. I'm just trying to think. I don't know. Graham would be so cross with me, wouldn't he? Possibly as much as 2 years. It started in lockdown because I think we were both looking for things to do and ways to market in the new world where everything was digital. And so that's how it started. And I think we've done a shocking number of episodes. I think we're coming up towards 40 now. So yes, I don't think we ever thought it'd last that long.
No, I don't think you do when you start. I mean, it's similar for me. It just kind of happens, doesn't it, and carries on.
Well, quite, yes.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of like topics and stuff that you cover, is there any like common theme throughout your episodes?
So what we try to do is we try to cover aspects. So I mentioned at the start that I specialise in international tax, and that might be confusing to people because, of course, there are no genuinely international taxes. So when I say I specialise in international tax, what I really mean is I specialise in the UK and Jersey taxation of people who might be internationally mobile, so they live in more than one country, or they might have property in different countries, or they might have income arising in a different jurisdiction. They might have businesses, companies in different jurisdictions. So with the ITB podcast, what we focus on is things that are of interest to people in that field or hoping to go into that field. So sort of aspects of international taxation. So from the very basic sort of concepts that are relevant, like residence and domicile, up to some of sort of the really cutting edge stuff like the OECD pillars and DAC 7.
Yeah, which I've heard the acronyms for those a lot, but I must admit, because I don't practice or have any knowledge of international tax, they mean absolutely nothing to me.
Yeah, it's a relatively narrow field, and indeed we had a guest on the other week who told us that all proper international tax lawyers are both practicing lawyers and academics, which left us feeling a little bit deflated because we're obviously not proper international tax lawyers. So it is quite a small field, particularly if you take that definition of a proper international lawyer.
Yeah. He's just made up that definition up for himself, though, by the sounds of it. This probably suit his needs.
It's not one I've heard elsewhere.
Yeah. So kind of moving on to then like what barristers do, like particularly tax barristers, kind of what are the typical activities that you kind of do in a normal week, and where do you kind of spend most of your time?
Okay, so one of the things about being a tax barrister as opposed to a general barrister is that even if you represent HMRC, you don't tend to spend as much time in court as, say, somebody working as a criminal barrister. So I spend quite a lot of time at a desk. And when I am at my desk, what I will be doing is one of several things. Firstly, writing advice. So giving people written advice on their tax position or on the tax consequences of something they're considering doing, or on the tax consequences of something they've already done and that they now need to get out.
Yeah.
And I have to say, when we get that situation, at least half the time they're not very happy with the advice, which is, well, you should have said something before you did it. So I spend a lot of time doing that. It might also be things like advising on litigation or on settling litigation. So looking at correspondence with HMRC and advising on how that might be carried out. Then there's also the element of advising in person. So I might be sitting in a room with my solicitor, my instructing solicitor or accountant, and the lay client. So advising sort of there. And we tend to do that when it's necessary to have more back and forth, when there might be information that needs to feed in so that I can give good, broad tax advice about the scenario in question. And then finally, in court or preparing for court. So I might be writing a skeleton argument, or I might actually be in one of the tax tribunals or one of the UK courts, because while tax matters are primarily dealt with by the tax tribunals, of course, tax-related matters can end up in other courts. The first way that they do is if they sort of progress from the first tier tribunal tax to the upper tribunal tax and chancery, and those are the specialist tribunals. But from there, if there's another appeal, that will go to the Court of Appeal. So that's one way that I end up in the mainstream court system. The other way is tax can lead, obviously, you can get some unintended tax consequences. And when that happens, particularly in the case of trusts, the High Court has a jurisdiction that it may exercise to sort of unwind transactions with retrospective effect, so as to erase the tax consequences effectively and put you back in the position that you're in to begin with. That's called the mistake jurisdiction. Some people might know about the sort of the similar jurisdiction from the case Pitt v Holt. So that's how I might end up in the High Court. or on occasion, not that frequently, I end up in the family division advising, or not advising, arguing on the tax consequences of any proposed ancillary relief settlements. And of course, I might also be advising on Jersey law or appearing in the Jersey courts. But again, when I appear in Jersey, there tends to be a tax element of that.
Yeah, makes sense. There's quite a lot of different things then. Can we unpack a few of them? Because I think like the writing advice, a lot of people who work in tax will probably understand and kind of appreciate, whereas some of the other things that you do, I think, are probably less well known, or at least in terms of like the detail of what they include. So like when you mentioned about like advising on litigation and settling, for example. So obviously there's like tax investigation experts out there that typically aren't like lawyers or solicitors or barristers. Is the work that you kind of do there similar to what they would do, or is there a difference?
So one of the great things about working in tax that I think we maybe don't get so broadly at other areas of the bar is that I often work in a team of people who all have overlapping tax knowledge and skills, but bring different other skills to the table. So it might be that I will advise on sort of interactions with HMRC in the absence of a tax investigation specialist. I might just do that, and then what I would do would be likely to encompass some of the things that they do. But on occasion, I will quite often advise in conjunction with a tax investigation specialist. So my role will sort of straddle two things. It will be advising on the law, but it will also be advising on how to present that to HMRC. So almost I always say this is a form of written advocacy. And so you want a barrister's skills because you are trying to present your position in a way that is going to convince somebody. So even when there's a tax investigation specialist involved, I might well have some input into how we approach HMRC, though it's obviously a different input to that which the tax investigation specialist might have.
Yeah. Okay. So if I'm kind of following correctly then anyway, so I suppose there's always like two parts of that, because obviously if it goes to court, I think that's when it becomes litigation, right? But before that, is it settling?
Oh, this is a very good question, Jack, and it's one that troubles barristers, because barristers, unless they have done a specific course, are not allowed to conduct litigation. That is for solicitors only. And so we would like to know where the dividing line is. But when I went and did the course, they didn't seem to know where the dividing line was either. So generally speaking, in a tax appeal, the litigation starts once you send your appeal to the tribunal. Before that, it's all, it might be negotiation, it might be mediation, it might be compromise, it might just be correspondence in a tax investigation. One way to look at it is that is still contentious work, because there's a dispute. It's contentious, but it's not necessarily litigation until, I would say, it hits the appeal to the tribunal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, makes sense. So I suppose one last point around that then is, so let's say that HMRC started an inquiry on a taxpayer. Would you ever be involved from the start of that, or do you tend to come in at the point there's a dispute?
Yes, I do. I am involved in inquiries from the start on occasion. It's one of the things, again, that I say is, if there is an inquiry, even if you've been randomly selected, you still want to present the information in the best way possible. It's still a written advocacy exercise, and so it never hurts to get the barrister in early. And I say that's particularly the case, for example, in domicile inquiries. So I don't know how familiar your audience will be with this, but a domicile inquiry can get out of hand quite quickly, because obviously it's very fact-based. And HMRC will understandably want to see an awful lot of information about and evidence to support the intentions of the settler, i.e. whether they intended to remain somewhere permanently or indefinitely. Sorry, the settler, the taxpayer. You can tell I've got a big trusts case at the moment. So they'll want to know, that they will want a lot of sort of hopefully contemporaneous evidence to assist with that. And what you often find is people aren't overly effusive with sharing information to begin with, and I understand that. But what you tend to get is sort of this Hydra Medusa type effect, where you answer 3 questions and that prompts another 10 questions. So you answer those 10 questions and that prompts another 27 questions. And this phenomenon is particularly apparent in domicile inquiries. And so I think sometimes it can be really helpful in those circumstances to have somebody like me in at the start. And some people do, but quite often we only start to see things after they really start to go wrong.
Yeah, no. There's kind of is a bit of overlap, isn't there, between, I suppose, what a barrister would do and what a tax advisor would do? Because I think probably even a tax advisor could help with the early stages of the inquiry as well.
Yes.
I mean, do you think there's any kind of benefit about going towards a barrister than there is towards a tax advisor, say?
The only benefit, and you may or may not need this, is that I think we have slightly different training, and so it depends which one you're going to need better. So things like, I can't really help with anything accountancy based because I'm not qualified to advise on it, and I have very limited experience of it. My experience comes from looking at what accountants put forward in the cases that I deal with. And so under those circumstances, you might be, if that was something that was focused on, you might be much better off with a tax advisor. What a barrister has that maybe a tax advisor doesn't so much is, obviously we have this experience of presenting things, and we have a very particular way of looking at the law, which is going to be more akin to the way that a court would look at the law. Now you say, well, we're not at court and we don't want to get to court, but sometimes by having somebody who has a better idea, nobody ever knows what a court's going to say. That's the golden rule of barristering. Don't think you know what they're going to say. But having a better idea of what they might say can actually help even right from the start. I know that sounds silly, but it allows you to avoid, because one of the things that is particularly prevalent, say you have an inquiry and you eventually end up in court, which you don't want to, but you do eventually end up in court. If you've been inconsistent, if you've changed strategy, HMRC's lawyers will understandably, again, really focus in on that. And that can be really counterproductive. So it can help because the law can be presented in a way that in a consistent way, but also in a way that's that might well sort of encourage HMRC to that way of thinking. So it's different skill sets, and both sometimes, again, quite frequently I'll be instructed on something like this where there is also a tax advisor. And obviously, if you have the money and it's worth doing it, it's maybe best to have all of those skills at your disposal. But yeah, where you don't, then it's picking which skill set's going to be more important to you.
Yeah, and I suppose it depends on like the size of the tax that's at stake. If it's millions, and it makes sense to get more involved. But if it's, say, like, I don't know, 20 grand, probably doesn't make sense to have every kit and caboodle kind of there.
Yeah, exactly.
Just a reminder to benchmark your salary and find out what you're worth, or discuss available tax roles. Get in contact with James at the Tax Recruitment Company. Contact details are within the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP59, or you can book a call with him directly by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. So just on kind of the writing advice things, it sounds like that's actually probably a big element of what you do.
It is. Yes.
What does that kind of entail then? Because would you be the one that would do the research and stuff yourself, or do you have people that you would delegate that to? Do you just write like the final advice? Kind of how are you involved with that now as like a fully qualified barrister with a lot of experience?
So one of the things about barristers is that we are all self-employed. So we're in a chambers together. But I mean, that's most akin to effectively a cost sharing arrangement. It's a bit more than that. It's a very anachronistic practice. We're not in partnership together. So we're associated with each other, but we're also completely individual. So barristers are not the best at delegating or sharing. So I tend to do all of my research myself. One thing that we might do is we might use a much more junior barrister, and I rarely do this because I'm not a silk, a King's Counsel now. That's an even more senior, a very sort of excellent barrister. But one uses maybe some of the most junior barristers as what's called devils, and they do deviling. So I might occasionally ask somebody to devil something for me, but mostly I do everything that goes into my advices myself, probably 95% of the time. So I do the research, which is one of the aspects of the job that I really like. I do the writing. So that we tend to work alone.
Yeah, I was going to say, because for someone that really likes research, then really, I think being a barrister is probably a good role for them. If they like doing research, they like writing advice, and they like putting forward arguments, which I suppose that's essentially what it is when you go to court. It'd probably be a pretty good fit for someone.
Yes. And the only thing I would say is people tend to think of barristers as academic, and actually you also have to be brutally practical as well. And sort of overly, one of the best pieces of advice I was given when I started my career was by a silk called James Kessler, then QC, now Casey. And he said, the reason you as a barrister are there is to tell people what the position is when nobody else knows. You cannot sit on the fence. You need to come up with an answer. And I think that was really brilliant advice. And this goes to the being brutally practical as well, because you can't say, oh, well, it's all very interesting and it might be this and it might be that, off you go. You have to be able to say, look, it might be this and it might be that. And really, there's not a lot to choose between them. But in my view, it's going to be this for these reasons. And so you do need to be practical. It might be something practical like saying, look, yes, you're probably right, but you'll spend £100,000 fighting this and it's £20,000 of tax.
Yeah.
And you might recover your costs, but there's then the litigation risk as well as the stress. Have a think about what you want to do. Or it might be being practical. So, for example, you might be able to come up with some wonderful structuring whereby, I don't know, somebody sets up their business abroad and moves abroad to because this is going to be absolutely the best for tax purposes, but they've got 3 children in school and their elderly mother is dying, so they don't want to move abroad.
Yeah.
You know, so it's a bit of a mix of the two. But yes, that aspect of it is brilliant, and that's one of the really nice things about tax, I suspect, from any perspective, is it's always changing, you're always learning, and there are always new things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When you started kind of describing about kind of what you meant by always giving an answer, I was thinking, well, where's this going? Because obviously there's plenty of tax rules legislation that is ambiguous and unclear. There just is, isn't there? And I think what you're saying in the end is that whilst you might say there's multiple different possibilities, you're saying this one, in your view, is the most likely outcome based on all the circumstances.
Exactly. And that is, I think that is maybe where barristers differ from some of the other tax professionals, or at least in the view of my head of chambers, and in my view as well, is you only come to us when you're really stumped and you don't know what the answer is. So we have to give you an answer. That's what we're for.
Yeah, I get that. I think probably just kind of more widely for just general tax professionals, to say an advisor not legally trained. I think the skill of like doing the tax research and actually finding the answer just lacks a little bit in a lot of cases. And I think that's probably because so many people are used to having people around them that already know the answer to something. So then they never have to kind of practice the skill, if that makes sense.
It does, and that's interesting, because I would say my chambers is really supportive, and the fact that we're not, if I make money, it doesn't really help anybody else in chambers. They are very supportive, but you can't. I mean, I think if I were, well, I know because I've seen him do it to someone else, but if I were to go to my head of chambers, for example, and say, "Oh, do you happen to know what the answer to this is?" and it was quite clear I'd made no effort, I would get very short shrift indeed.
Yeah.
And a completely different matter if I said, look, I've looked in this book, I've looked in that book, I've searched through the case law, I found this, there isn't any particular answer, I think it might be this or that. What do you think? He'd be delighted to discuss it with me. So very supportive, but not if I turned up saying, do you happen to know what the answer is?
Yeah, which I think happens a lot more probably in like accountancy practices, because there's usually like one person that's seen as like an expert or specialist in like one area.
Yeah.
Whereas I think as a barrister, you seem to practice more over, say, a wider range of, say, legislation and tax rules, so that it's almost impossible for you to know that answer immediately. You might have a good idea, but to be certain, you have to go and check, basically.
Yeah. One of the things, so I guess that I have 2 things that I always say about this. I can always remember the first time when I was in practice and I came across something that I had done before, like the same question arose. I was 3 years in. That was the first time. I was like, I know the answer to this. I've seen this before. So there's that. And I think the other thing that I would say, the other thing I would say about that is it can be quite intimidating, because you might be getting you will be getting sort of 3 or 4 specialists coming into conference with you, and they might be asking you a question, say, about transfer pricing rules, and all they will do day in, day out is transfer pricing rules, and they come to you as like the specialist, and you think, oh God, how do I deal with this?
Yeah.
And so I think it is very much a matter. I always say this to myself, which is, it's not about knowing the answer, it's about knowing where to look to find the answer, which brings us to research skills, doesn't it? So like you say, now that I've been in practice for more years than I'd care to admit to, I have this bank of knowledge, so I can look at something and think, oh well, the transactions and securities rules might be relevant. Do I need to worry about offshore income gains? Is there a problem with the transfer of assets abroad code? What about Section 3 TCGA? And so I know, and I can go and look at all of those, and I might dismiss some of them quite quickly, but I know they all might be relevant to the problem. But when you're starting out, you don't have any of that, and that can be really terrifying.
Yeah, I remember actually, because I think my career's been, I suppose, a bit unusual compared to a lot of tax professionals, I would say, because very early on as a non-like barrister or legal person, I actually did a lot of research. And I do remember like those first few pieces of like in-depth, complicated research that I did, it took ages. It was complicated. There were so many different branches that I needed to check to make sure that it was even relevant or I could disregard it. But then I suppose now, fast forward like 7 years, I kind of know straight away what most of the key tax rules are going to be, so that I can go straight to them and look at them and then just kind of like brush up around the edges, I suppose, to make sure that nothing else is relevant. And that's a much easier task than like having no idea where to start at all.
You know which pond you're fishing in.
Yeah, exactly. You know what act to start in, probably in most cases. You might even know that there's a VAT implication as well that you need to consider, whereas obviously when you first start off, you don't know any of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think where you don't have the backup of a firm, that can be quite intimidating. But equally, my then pupil supervisor, Rory Mullen KC, was always very supportive, and I could always talk to him. And so it's important to have support in chambers, but you have to make sure that you're not going to irritate people by just going, can you just do my work for me?
Yeah.
Quite rightly so as well.
So, I mean, you kind of alluded to a few things that have probably changed there over the years in terms of like, obviously now research is different to how you would have undertaken initially, but do you think any other kind of aspects of your job have changed since you've become more experienced? And I suppose the concept of seniority doesn't really exist as much in the world of being a barrister, but kind of the equivalent of that, if you kind of see what I mean. Yeah,
so one of the things that I find hard about being a barrister is there's not sort of like a hierarchy. Well, there's a very basic hierarchy. It goes barrister, junior barrister, King's Counsel, judge, basically.
Yeah.
It's a very flat hierarchy. And so it's quite hard to measure. It feels quite hard to measure progress sometimes. And yeah, so I think that is one thing. But so the first way that it's changed, I've had a couple of pupils now. So I've had trainees. That's really hard. That's really hard when you haven't worked regularly with people for sort of the better part of a decade.
Yeah.
But that's one change. I think people start listening to you. You'll have these conversations in chambers. In our chambers we all meet up twice a week. We have tea one afternoon a week, and we have drinks one evening a week. And we tend to talk about tax, what we're doing, etc. And A, you start to know the answers, and B, you realise that people actually start to listen to your opinion. Oh wow! And then that's quite scary, because you're like, I was just shooting. I haven't really thought that through. Maybe I should be more careful with what I say. And the work gets more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
the values go up. But you can get very low value things that are complicated, and you can get very high value things that are very straightforward. So that's not necessarily the same, but you certainly start to see the more complicated things, and you certainly start to see the more high value things that are not necessarily in one package.
Yeah, I think that kind of segues on nicely then to kind of talk about, I suppose, remuneration for barristers. So I know, at least in your case, obviously you work in a chambers and you're technically self-employed and stuff. So how does that kind of all work then with remuneration?
So, remuneration as a barrister, much maligned topic. So your fees will be set by your clerk. Once you get a bit more senior, they tend to be set more in conjunction between you and your clerk. You are not paid in advance. If we did what's called direct access work, where you're not instructed by a solicitor or accountant or step advisor or CTA, etc., we generally take payment in advance. So that will only be sort of, we'll say this is the work we're doing and this is the price that it costs, and that's that. And then the clerks go and collect your fees, which obviously doesn't involve going around the houses collecting your fees.
Yeah.
And sometimes people don't pay for ages. I think our terms are 30 days. I'm always really surprised if anyone pays within the period that they're supposed to pay in.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be hard. You have spotty remuneration. So, for example, you might do a big case, and what we try to do nowadays is you'll have some of that money for that case paid before the case and some paid after, because if it settles or whatever, you could have spent, say you had a huge case, you could have spent 6 months doing virtually nothing else, settles at the court door. You might not be entitled to any of your fee unless you've been given tranche payments. So we tend to do that. But essentially, if you do one big piece of work and they decide not to pay for 2 or 3 months, you might find that you have cash flow issues.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing you did mention there right at the start then was about kind of the clerk. And obviously we're talking about barristers being self-employed or working part of chambers and not really having like your own staff. So how does that kind of work then? Do you have to pay like a fee or something to the chambers?
Yes. What we do in our chambers is we pay a percentage of chambers expenses, which covers things like the building, sort of legal resources like LexisNexis and Westlaw, and the clerks' salaries. We pay a monthly contribution, and that's essentially the percentage of chambers. I think it's turnover. The percentage of chambers turnover is the percentage of chambers expenses that you pay. And so our poor senior clerk at the start of each year, he comes around and asks everybody what they think their fees might be for the next year, and everyone goes, "Oh, not very much, not very much." And then on that basis, he calculates the monthly contributions, and then it all sort of gets totted up once a quarter. So if you've had a quarter where you maybe haven't done quite so much work, you might get a little bit of money back. If you've had a really good quarter, you might have to pay a bit extra.
Yeah, makes sense. I know this is obviously it can completely vary. I appreciate that. It's going to be dependent on a lot of things like experience, the work, and etc. you work on. But what kind of, I suppose, figures can you earn a year as a barrister? Like kind of a rough lower band and a rough higher band.
So as a barrister in tax, there's a dividing factor. If you do a lot of work for HMRC, now if you want to work for HMRC, you have to be on something called the Attorney General's panel. And the Attorney General's panel has 3 sort of levels. There's the C panel, the B panel, and the A panel. C panel is the most junior, A panel is the most senior. There isn't a panel for silks. HMRC will go directly to the silk they want. But the fees for panel work are much less than the fees in private practice. So there can be quite a lot of variation, because if you have a practice that's strongly skewed towards working for HMRC, you'll earn quite a lot less than somebody who has a private practice. I would expect most barristers to be into 6 figures. Most tax barristers, obviously across the other areas of the bar, it varies greatly. I would expect a tax barrister to be into 6 figures in their first 3 or 4 years, possibly sooner. And silks can regularly have taxable income of more than of 7 figures.
So that's a lot.
It can be remunerated very well, but there is a lot of variation.
Yeah. But I suppose you kind of get out what you put in a way, because I imagine the work-life balance at times can be particularly bad if you're working on an important case with a short deadline.
Yes. So I think the compensation for some, the good things about the work-life balance is that other than clients and your clerks, you are in charge of your time. If you want to do all your work in the middle of the night, you can. And indeed, I have a colleague who lives in the US who, by necessity of time zone, does an awful lot of her work in the middle of the night. So there is that. The downside from a work-life balance perspective is that if you are going to be very fussy about working when you want to work, or if you have sort of things like childcare constraints, that is going to limit the work that you can do, because people will turn up at the 11th hour and say, can you do X overnight? And if you can't say yes, that is going to limit your client base. And so there is, as you say, that element of you don't have control over the workflow, and you can't, you can say I'm too busy, but you can't just put things down at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. or 10 p.m. because you have court deadlines, or you might have revenue deadlines. So there is that. And then it's a bit like the cash flow. You might have weeks or even months where you've got very little work, which is terrifying. And then other periods where you might have a really big case that's really full on, or lots of advisory work to do. And that's also terrifying. So I think really maybe the main takeaway for people from this should be that I find being a barrister terrifying on a daily basis.
So one thing then kind of related to the whole Chambers thing of being self-employed, can you be an employed barrister? Is that a thing, or is the only option to be self-employed?
You absolutely can be an employed barrister. It's not, I think the majority of barristers are self-employed, but you can be an employed barrister. You might be in the government legal service. And indeed, we have someone in our chambers who used to be an employed barrister for HMRC, who's now come into private practice. You might, some law firms, some accountancy firms might have a barrister in-house. Even just some very big companies might have a barrister in-house, dependent on what their business model is. In tax, I suspect if you are an employed barrister, you're most likely to be in the government legal service.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, it is absolutely an option.
Okay. So I know you've kind of gone over how to become a barrister, a tax barrister, a bit earlier in the episode. Let's say for someone like me who hasn't done a law degree and hasn't got any kind of direct legal experience, how long would it take for me to, say, convert into a barrister, roughly, do you think?
That's a good question. And it can vary. So solicitors, let's start with the slightly easier one. A tax solicitor might well become a tax barrister fairly straightforwardly. What they would have to do is they would have to go to the Bar Standards Board, and they would make a case for having some lesser period of pupillage and lesser period of training, and the BSB would tell them what they had to do from the training perspective, which would probably be some ethics courses and some advocacy courses, and how long a pupillage they would have to do, which might be anything from 1 or 2 months to the full year that most people have to do, dependent on the level of their experience. I think you can do the same thing if you're a professional like an accountant, but I suspect the period of pupillage might be longer, or you might be required to do all of the modules of, say, the conversion course. So it could take quite a long time, but it tends to depend on what your previous experience is, and so it might be quite specific to the individual.
Okay, fair enough. If we were to go on like worst case scenario, then what do you think that would look like?
You would have to do your conversion course, which is a year. You would have to do your vocational training, which is a year, and you would then have to do your pupillage, which would be a year. So it could be 3 years. And if you had to work at the same time, you might be doing those part-time. So yeah, I think I'm trying to think. My sister decided to become a lawyer quite randomly, and she was working in a law firm, and she, I think, managed to do the conversion and the vocational stage while working in 2 years, but I don't think it was very pleasant. So she effectively worked full-time, did 2 full-time courses, and yeah, it was not fun to be around her while she was doing that. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it.
in some ways, because like when I decided to work in tax, I didn't really know that, like, without doing a law degree and stuff, that becoming a tax barrister could have been an option. Because I do think if I would have known about it before I started, I'd have seriously considered it. I just think no, because of like the lifestyle and everything else that's happening in life and stuff. I just feel like it'd be too difficult to like convert. If that makes sense.
I don't know about that, and you should certainly, if it's something you're interested in, you should certainly look into the process. You can visit either the Bar Council or the Bar Standards Board websites, and they will have good information about that. And one of the things that I bang on about, which I'm sure irritates people who hear me bang on about it a lot, is I genuinely feel that diversity of any kind makes the bar better as a whole, and people with different skill sets and different ways of having come to the bar are an absolute asset to us, and that's the same in tax as well. And so I would definitely consider it. I mean, I sit here and I say, oh, it's terrifying and all the rest of it. I really like what I do. And I fell into it. I genuinely really fell into tax as opposed to barristering. And I'm so lucky because it's such a good fit for me. And yes, there are things I don't like about it, but it's a job. And I think there are things that you don't like about any job. I don't like the cash flow difficulties because I find that stressful. I don't like the not knowing where the next piece of work is coming from. But the actual work, I love. And so I do you know what? It's like Stockholm syndrome. I think it's the first time I've ever said this. If people with a tax background are genuinely interested in this, like you, Jack, definitely look into it, because it's a good career, and I'm maybe a little bit cynical, but yeah, it's a great career.
Yeah, do you know what it is for me? It's the parts of working in tax that I genuinely enjoy the most are doing research, providing advice, talking with clients, and just like debating things. And I feel like a lot of those things you do a lot of being a barrister.
It might be the job for you.
So I think you've already kind of covered this off anyway with a lot of what you just said, but kind of any closing thoughts then for anyone that is considering becoming a tax barrister?
Yes, I think I do give quite a cynical view of it, but just because for certain, I think there's a perception at the bar that to be a tax barrister, you've got to be really, really clever. And I don't actually think that's true. I think you have to have the right sort of brain. You have to think about things in a certain way. And I think you have to enjoy certain things for it to be something that you can do sustainably, which isn't necessarily the same as being really bright. I'm sure being really bright probably helps with that. So I think there's two things there. First of all, don't be put off by this, if you sort of come across it, by this idea that everybody is the brain of Britain. I know I'm not, and I'm making a decent fist of it, I suppose. So, there's one person. But secondly, you might not find out that it's not for you until you're sort of into it a little bit, and that can be quite upsetting. So I think, because I've seen it upset people. So I think there's that aspect of it. It's a bit of a gamble. The next thing I would say is it can be quite brutal and quite lonely. If you don't like sitting in a room for 12 hours a day by yourself looking at a computer, it's probably not for you, because you are going to have days like that. And if you have an advisory focused practice like I do, you're going to have a lot of them. I love it.
Yeah.
Love it. But I know it's not for everyone. And particularly in the very early years, the cash flow and the workflow can be really terrifying. That can be really scary. So again, that's not something that you should let yourself be put off by, but you do need to think about it.
Yeah.
You need to think about how you would deal with that. And I think if you know about it, you can potentially, look at how you would manage that sort of situation, but it can be quite scary if you're not expecting it.
For anyone who wants to kind of learn a bit more about you then, Harriet, or get in touch, where are the best places for them to go?
So for me specifically, there's my Chambers website. There is LinkedIn. I'm quite active on LinkedIn. If you want to learn more about becoming my Chambers is Old Square Tax Chambers. If you want to learn more about becoming a barrister, go to the Bar Council or the BSB, or drop me a line and I will try to get back to you. You can do that, as I say, via my Chambers website or on LinkedIn.
Thanks to Harriet for giving up her time to come on this podcast episode. Show notes for this episode can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP59. They include all the links mentioned throughout this episode, including a link to Harriet's LinkedIn profile and a link to the podcast that she co-hosts, International Tax Bites. The last episode of the podcast was an insight into what it's like to be a member of a CIOT technical committee based on my experiences. So if you're interested in becoming a member or learning more about technical committees, then I can suggest that you give this episode a listen. The next episode of the podcast will be some real stories from fellow tax professionals on how they have developed their tax research skills or how they are currently going about developing them. I think that this is a vital skill for tax professionals, but it's also one that often seems to be neglected and put into the too hard pile. But keep an eye out for this one. It will be live on the 24th of October 2022. To make sure you get a notification for this episode and all future episodes for that matter, you can subscribe to the podcast by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. But that's it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.